What if everything you thought you knew about royal legacy could be rewritten with just one pen stroke? Imagine this, a sacred document, sealed behind palace doors, carrying the final wishes of the longest reigning monarch in modern history, Queen Elizabeth II. Now picture someone stepping into that silence, breaking centuries of tradition and daring to alter it. And not just anyone, but her own grandson, Prince Harry. Already, the air feels heavy, doesn't it? The idea alone raises the question, how far can someone go when desperation and fractured loyalty collide? This is where our story begins, inside a monarchy that has stood the test of wars, divorces, scandals, and betrayals. A monarchy that has faced whispers of abdication, the shocking death of Princess Diana, and relentless pressure from media around the globe. Yet for all of those storms, perhaps nothing could have prepared the royal family for what happened when Harry returned to the UK under the guise of reconciliation. He didn't just bring baggage from California. He carried secrets, resentment, and, allegedly, the willingness to cross a line no royal had dared to cross before. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But why does this matter now? Because in the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's passing, her will became more than just a legal document. It became a symbol of continuity, a roadmap for the monarchy's survival, and a reflection of the Queen's lifelong commitment to stability. The will wasn't just about distributing wealth. It was about protecting the institution she had safeguarded for over 70 years. And yet, reports whisper that Harry, once hailed as the people's prince, allegedly tried to tip that balance in his favor. Let's pause and ask ourselves, what drives a man to such an act? Was it desperation to secure financial freedom after stepping away from royal duties? Was it revenge for years of feeling sidelined, dismissed, and treated as the spare? Or was it something more calculated, an attempt to reshape the monarchy's future even as he publicly distanced himself from it? Here's the irony. Harry's trip back to the UK was painted as an olive branch. Cameras captured his steps at the airport, his car ride through London, the faint smile when asked about seeing his family again. The headlines screamed reconciliation. The palace issued carefully crafted statements about unity, healing, and the importance of moving forward. But behind those gilded walls, tension was bubbling. Because when families fight, it's messy. And when royal families fight, the entire world is watching. That's the stage we're setting. A fragile family gathering, shadowed by years of bitterness and betrayal. And then, an act that could unravel it all. Princess Anne, known for her sharp eye and unwavering devotion to duty, was there at the critical moment. The woman who has spent her entire life putting country before self, duty before desire, stumbled upon something she could hardly believe. A sight that would make her heart race and her voice catch in her throat. Let's take a step back and imagine it vividly. A dimly lit room in a centuries-old palace. The walls lined with history. Portraits of monarchs past, their stern eyes watching. On the desk, a leather-bound folder, embossed with the royal seal. Inside, the Queen's will, a document so heavily guarded that only a handful of people in the entire world had ever laid eyes on it. And then, Harry, alone, leaning over it, pen in hand. The weight of the crown he had turned his back on, pressing down on his every movement. Now, I know what you're thinking. Could this really happen? Could someone so high-profile risk everything in such a brazen act? History tells us that power, inheritance, and legacy often breed the most audacious choices. Think of royal siblings throughout history. Rivals turned enemies over crowns, estates, and wills. Blood may be thicker than water, but in the world of monarchy, ink on paper can sever bonds forever. The world remembers Elizabeth as a monarch of steel and composure. A woman who lived through World War II, who worked with 15 prime ministers, who embodied restraint and sacrifice. Her will, then, was not just about distributing personal possessions. It was about setting the tone for the next generation of royals. It was about deciding who carried her torch and who was left in the shadows. To tamper with that is not only betrayal, it's rewriting history. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about estates, jewelry, or private collections. This was about symbolism. Which grandchildren she trusted, which family members she wanted remembered, which legacies she wanted etched into the monarchy's story. For Harry to allegedly attempt to alter that narrative wasn't just a personal gamble. It was an attack on the very identity of the monarchy itself. Picture, and in that moment, the Princess Royal, known for her no-nonsense approach, the royal workhorse who has carried out thousands of engagements without complaint. She has seen scandal. She has seen betrayal. She has endured the glare of headlines that mocked her style, her bluntness, even her relevance. But nothing could have prepared her for this. Because in that moment, Harry wasn't just the Queen's grandson. He was a threat to her legacy. Ask yourself this. What would you do if you caught someone tampering with a loved one's last wishes? Would you confront them? Would you stay silent? Would you rush to protect the truth, no matter the cost? That's the dilemma and faced in real time. And her choice, in that instant, would set the stage for chaos that the royal family could not contain. Because once that secret escaped the room, it would ignite fury in Charles, in William, and in the very heart of the monarchy itself. The act wasn't just symbolic. It was dangerous. It was irreversible. And here's where the story sharpens to its point. Harry's attempt, if true, was more than reckless. It was the spark in a powder keg of resentment that had been building for years. From the Megxit drama to explosive interviews, to memoirs and documentaries that painted the royal family in an unforgiving light, the trust was already shattered. This, then, was the final crack in the glass. But before we dive into the eruption, before we unravel the palace confrontations and the media firestorm, let's sit with this image one last time. And, standing frozen in a dim corridor, watching her nephew hunched over the Queen's will. A single decision away from exposing him. A single moment that could change everything. Because what came next would not only shake the walls of Buckingham Palace. It would shake the entire world. What happens when reconciliation is nothing more than a mask? When the smile at the airport hides clenched teeth, and the promise of healing conceals an agenda? That was the paradox of Prince Harry's return to the UK. On paper, it was a mission of peace. A son coming back to reconnect with his father, King Charles. A brother extending his hand to Prince William. A family stitching together the rips that had torn them apart. But beneath the polished headlines, something darker brewed. The cameras told one story. The palace told another. And inside those gilded walls, the truth was far more fragile than the world realized. The moment Harry stepped foot on British soil, it was as if history itself had paused. Crowds gathered, some cheering, others whispering. Would this be the moment the prodigal son returned to the fold? Or would it become yet another chapter in a saga of betrayal and bitterness? You could almost feel the contradictions in the air. A royal motorcade driving him from the airport, yet his eyes fixed on the tinted glass, avoiding the faces of the very people he claimed he wanted to reconcile with. Smiles for the cameras, but tension etched into every line of his face. Can you imagine the weight of walking into a home where you are both family and outcast? This was no ordinary family reunion. It was theater. Every glance, every word, every handshake had meaning. Because reconciliation wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about power. And Harry knew that. Let's rewind for a moment. Ever since the explosive interviews, the documentaries, and the memoirs that painted the royal family in a cold, unforgiving light, the relationship between Harry and the rest of the Windsors had crumbled. Bridges weren't just burned, they were reduced to ashes. And yet, in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's passing, the world expected unity. They expected her children and grandchildren to stand as one, to honor her memory, to show the strength of a family that had survived everything from abdications to divorces to scandal. But was unity ever truly possible? That was the question hanging over every photograph of Harry arriving in London. The palace, of course, played its role with precision. Leaks to the press spoke of private meetings planned between Harry and his father, of a tentative olive branch from William. But insiders whispered that it was all fragile, a delicate dance held together by the thinnest of threads. Harry wasn't just walking into a family gathering. He was walking into a lion's den. And here's where the irony sharpens. While the world watched for hugs and handshakes, Harry allegedly had another plan. Because behind the scenes, reconciliation was not his only mission. Now picture the first meeting. A drawing room in Buckingham Palace, filled with silence. Charles seated, stoic, carrying the weight of both grief and kingship. William, arms crossed, eyes never leaving his brother. Harry walking in, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The tension was palpable. Charles, ever the diplomat, might have been the first to speak. Words of welcome, words of family. But the undertone was clear. Trust had been broken. William, less forgiving, didn't bother to hide his coldness. For him, this wasn't about a father's grief. This was about betrayal, pure and simple. Harry, for his part, tried to play both roles, the son seeking forgiveness and the man standing his ground. He spoke of moving forward, of rebuilding bonds, of honoring their mother's memory and their grandmother's legacy. But his words rang hollow. Because how do you reconcile with people who no longer believe you? Ask yourself this. Can a relationship survive once trust is shattered? When private words have been turned into public weapons, can there ever be true healing? The contradictions piled up quickly. On one hand, Harry insisted he wanted peace. On the other, he arrived with the same aura of defiance that had defined his departure years earlier. On one hand, the palace tried to present unity. On the other, whispers of suspicion filled every hallway. And through it all, one figure remained quietly vigilant, Princess Anne. She had lived through scandal before. She had endured public humiliation, divorces, and ridicule. But through it all, she had never wavered in her duty. For Anne, loyalty to the monarchy wasn't a choice. It was her very identity. And so, while Charles attempted diplomacy and William simmered in anger and watched, silent, sharp-eyed, waiting, it's worth pausing here. Why does reconciliation matter so much to the monarchy? Because the monarchy thrives on perception. The image of unity, of stability, of family. The Queen had embodied that image for decades. And with her gone, the cracks were showing. Harry's return was supposed to plaster over those cracks, to reassure the public that the Windsors were still a family, still strong. But behind closed doors, the fractures were deeper than ever. And that's where the shadow lies. Reconciliation, in this story, wasn't just about family. It was a cover, a mask, a performance for the cameras. Let's not forget, Harry had reasons to seek reconciliation beyond emotion. Financial pressures, security concerns, the growing distance between him and the monarchy that once defined him. For someone who had stepped away, his ties to the royal family still dictated his relevance. And what better way to secure influence than by ensuring his name carried weight in the Queen's legacy? The whispers began quietly. Staffers noticing odd requests. Harry asking questions about access. Meetings behind closed doors that weren't on the official schedule. And while Charles hoped for unity and William bristled with anger and started piecing it together. She knew when something didn't add up. Now, let's ask the audience directly. What would you have done in Harry's shoes? If you felt cast out, silenced, stripped of your role, would you try to change the story? Would you try to grab hold of whatever power remained? Or would you walk away completely, never looking back? This is where the line between desperation and betrayal begins to blur. Was Harry's return truly about family? Or was it always about opportunity? The palace corridors whispered their answer. Because late at night, while reconciliation played out for the cameras, another story was unfolding in silence. Harry's movements became less about conversation and more about access. Less about hugs and more about locked rooms. Less about forgiveness and more about legacy. Think of it like a play. Act 1, the smiling arrival. Act 2, the family meeting. Act 3, the secret agenda. And in the middle of it all, the tension grows. Because reconciliation wasn't real. It was a shadow, a cover for something that would soon explode into chaos. And when Princess Anne stepped into that dimly lit corridor, when she saw the unthinkable with her own eyes, the shadow lifted, and the truth stood naked in the light. But what she saw next would make the palace tremble, and it would mark the beginning of a scandal no one could control. What makes a document untouchable? Is it the ink on its pages, the signature at the bottom, or the sheer weight of history that clings to every word? For Queen Elizabeth II, her will was not just paperwork. It was legacy, power, and the final chapter of a life that defined an era. To alter it, even in the smallest way, would be to tamper with the very heart of Britain's monarchy. And yet, that is exactly what Prince Harry is accused of doing. Let's slow down here. Picture the Queen herself. 70 years on the throne. 15 prime ministers, countless crises, wars, triumphs, tragedies. Through it all, her defining trait was stability. She wasn't just a monarch, she was an anchor. Her will, then, wasn't a casual list of assets. It was a carefully considered blueprint, drafted with precision, secrecy, and an understanding of what her choices would mean for generations to come. Ask yourself, what possessions of hers carry the most meaning? Was it the crown jewels? The Balmoral estate where she spent her happiest days? The Windsor Castle artifacts steeped in centuries of history? Or was it something smaller, more personal? Pearls gifted to her by her father, letters written in her own hand, family heirlooms that carried whispers of the past? Every line in her will wasn't just about property. It was about memory. It was about control. It was about ensuring that even after death, her influence endured. The secrecy surrounding royal wills is legendary. Did you know that most royal wills are never made public? They're locked away, sealed under heavy protection, and guarded from prying eyes. Even the public never got to read Queen Elizabeth's father King George VI's will. The last time a royal will was fully revealed? Over a century ago. Since then, secrecy has been the rule. That's how much weight they carry. They're not just private, they're sacred. So imagine the audacity of one person deciding to meddle with it. And not just any person, but a grandson who had already torn himself from the royal fabric. A grandson who had accused his own family of cruelty, and who had built his identity around breaking free. Why? Then, return to this document. Here's the contradiction. Harry claimed independence. He wanted freedom. Yet in the shadows, he allegedly reached for influence within the most powerful and guarded symbol of the monarchy's continuity. Doesn't that strike you as ironic? The Queen's will was believed to address more than just estates and heirlooms. Rumors swirled that it might also settle questions of titles. Would Archie and Lilibet, Harry's children, be recognized in ways that the monarchy had resisted? Would Meghan receive tokens of acknowledgement or deliberate omission? Would William's children be elevated even higher, securing the line of succession? Every question mattered. Every word mattered. And for Harry, whose grievances with the monarchy centered around status, recognition, and financial security, the will was more than family business. It was leverage. Now think about the Queen's character. She was meticulous, calculated. She left nothing to chance. Do you believe she would have left her wishes vague or open to manipulation? No. And yet, history teaches us that even the most carefully drawn plans can be tampered with. We've seen it before. Royal wills in centuries past being contested, hidden, even altered. Relatives fighting over jewels, titles, land. It's not new. It's a royal tradition of its own, though one shrouded in silence. And in this case, it wasn't just about greed. It was about rewriting legacy. Imagine the scene again. A room secured by locks. The Queen's will lying inside a sealed folder. The desk upon which it rested might as well have been an altar, because to the monarchy, that document was sacred scripture. Every distribution, every word carried consequences. If, and received Balmoral, it wasn't just inheritance, it was a statement of trust. If William's children were gifted priceless heirlooms, it wasn't just sentiment, it was preparing the line of succession. If Harry was included, or excluded, it spoke volumes about the Queen's final stance toward him. And then, Harry, allegedly leaning over it. His pen scratching. His eyes darting. What could he have been trying to change? Was it a word? A name? A small note of allocation? Maybe even something as simple as ensuring his children were not erased. Here's where we stop to ask, was this desperation or defiance? Was it a plea for belonging, or was it an act of revenge? Princess Anne, of all people, understood what was at stake. She had spent decades in the shadow of her mother's rule, carving her role not through drama, but through sheer dedication. While Charles wrestled with public perception, while Andrew stumbled from scandal to scandal and carried on with duty, she became the invisible backbone of the monarchy. And now, here she was, standing before her nephew, watching him break the sacred barrier no one else dared to cross. And let's not overlook the symbolism. A woman defined by loyalty, catching a man defined by rebellion. A daughter who never wavered confronting a grandson who couldn't stop wavering. The contrast was almost poetic. Now let's bring it back to you, the audience. If you were in Anne's shoes, would you have shouted? Would you have ripped the pen from Harry's hand? Or would you have stood frozen, your mind racing with the weight of what you were witnessing? Because for Anne, it wasn't just about stopping him. It was about what this meant. If Harry could do this once, what else could he do? If he could attempt to alter a will, Could he alter the narrative of the monarchy itself? Could he destroy their mother's legacy in the very moment they were trying to preserve it? That's why the Queen's will is untouchable, not because of the paper or the ink or the seals, but because it represents trust. It represents continuity. It represents something even death couldn't shake, control. And Harry, in that instant, allegedly tried to seize it for himself. Think about it. The Queen's legacy was a puzzle, carefully arranged. Each piece fit where it belonged. Harry was one of those pieces, but he had chosen to pull himself out. And yet, now, here he was, trying to redraw the puzzle's edges. Doesn't that make the betrayal sting even more? But what came next was even more explosive. Because silence didn't last. The confrontation was inevitable. The will was no longer just a private document. It became a battlefield. And when Anne opened her mouth to speak, her words cut through the silence like a blade. But how Harry reacted, that was the moment that turned shock into chaos. What happens when silence becomes the sharpest weapon in the room? Princess Anne had built her entire life around quiet resilience, stoic determination, and a refusal to play into drama. She wasn't like her brothers, often caught in the storm of public opinion. She wasn't like Diana, adored yet hounded. She wasn't even like her mother, who balanced duty with diplomacy, and was something different. She was the unflinching watchdog of the monarchy, the one who never blinked, the one who never backed down. And it was that silence, that steady, piercing watchfulness, that made her the last person Harry should have crossed paths with in that moment. Let's ask the question outright. Who really is Princess Anne? Too often overlooked in the glitz of royal drama, and has always been the workhorse. The daughter who never complained, never courted attention, but carried the monarchy's load on her back. She's completed thousands of engagements. She's known for her blunt remarks, her practical style, her refusal to indulge in theatrics. In many ways, she is the embodiment of what Queen Elizabeth valued most, duty without self-indulgence. So why does this matter? Because when Anne walked down that dim corridor and caught sight of Harry leaning over the Queen's will, she didn't see just a grandson. She saw a threat to everything she had spent her life protecting. Think about Anne's perspective for a moment. She had watched her family unravel in public for years. Andrew's scandals, Charles's turbulent marriages, Harry and Meghan's dramatic exit. And through it all, she stayed the course. She never gave long tell-all interviews. She never wrote memoirs tearing down her relatives. She kept her head down and did the work. That was her role, her armor. Now, here she was, staring at the unimaginable. Her nephew, the one who had left, the one who had hurled accusations against the family, the one who had claimed independence, tampering with the will of the monarch they had all sworn to serve. Can you imagine what ran through her mind in that split second? Shock, yes. Betrayal, of course. But above all, clarity. And wasn't one to hesitate. She wasn't one to second-guess. She knew exactly what this meant. And she knew what she had to do. Yet, here's the contradiction, and didn't storm into the room screaming. She didn't yank the pen from Harry's hand. She didn't raise her voice. Why? Because that's not who she is. Her power comes from control, from discipline, from the weight of her presence. And in that moment, her silence spoke louder than any words could. Harry looked up and saw her. Their eyes met. No words passed between them at first, but the air was thick enough to cut. It was as if the entire history of the royal family condensed into that stare. And the loyal daughter. Harry, the wayward grandson. One holding the line, the other crossing it. Let's turn the question on you. What would you do if you were Anne? Would you confront him directly, risking an explosive scene that could spiral into chaos? Or would you play it quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to expose him when the damage would be undeniable? And, true to form, chose the latter. Her silence was strategy, watching, measuring, letting Harry squirm in the weight of her gaze. That's the thing about Anne. Her strength isn't in noise, but in patience. And we can't ignore the emotional undertones here. Anne had always been close to her mother, the Queen. Of all the children, she was often described as the one most like Elizabeth, practical, unpretentious, focused. To see Harry, the Queen's grandson, allegedly tampering with her mother's final wishes was more than disrespect. It was personal. History gives us countless examples of Anne Steele. Remember the infamous kidnapping attempt in 1974 when a gunman tried to abduct her on the Mall in London? Anne's response, in the face of danger, was legendary. She looked the man in the eye and told him, "Not bloody likely. That's Anne. Fearless. Blunt. Immovable." If she could stare down a kidnapper with a gun, what chance did Harry have against her icy composure in a palace corridor? The weight of her silence pressed harder with every second. Harry knew he was caught. But here's the twist. Instead of backing away, instead of confessing, he tried to bluff. That's where Anne's role as watchdog became critical. Because she wasn't just witnessing, she was calculating. Watching every flicker of guilt, every tremor of defiance, every word Harry stumbled through as he tried to explain himself. Now, let's draw the bigger picture. Anne wasn't just protecting a document. She was protecting the monarchy's continuity. She understood what few others did, that the monarchy survives not through crowns or castles, but through trust. If the Queen's will was compromised, if her final wishes could be called into question, it wasn't just a family issue, it was a constitutional one. And in that moment, Anne became the guardian of that trust. The silent watchdog, the one who would ensure that her mother's legacy would not be defiled, no matter who stood against her. But here's the dramatic twist. Silence, as powerful as it was, couldn't last forever, and had to act. The question was when and how. Would she expose Harry immediately, creating an eruption in the palace that no one could contain? Or would she bide her time, gathering proof, waiting for the exact moment when her revelation would have maximum impact? Every second dragged with the weight of that decision. Harry's hand trembled slightly, his face tightening under her stare. The watchdog had caught him, but the punishment was still to come. Because Anne wasn't just going to stop him. She was going to make sure the entire royal family knew what he had done. And when she did, the chaos would be unstoppable. But before that storm broke, something unexpected happened. Harry opened his mouth, and the words he chose would ignite a fire no silence could ever contain. What is the weight of a room? Not in bricks or timber, but in history, in secrets, in silence, so thick it feels like you're trespassing in the presence of ghosts. That's the scene where everything unfolded. The very room where Queen Elizabeth's will lay, secured, sacred, untouchable. And it was in this room that Harry, of all people, allegedly decided to cross the line. Imagine it now. The room wasn't grand in the way you might picture from glossy documentaries. It wasn't a throne room with golden ceilings or a ballroom with chandeliers. No, this was quieter, more intimate. Dim light filtered through tall windows curtained in heavy fabric. A desk sat at the center, solid oak, polished by decades of use. Around it, shelves crammed with ledgers, files, and locked boxes. Portraits of monarchs past stared down from the walls. Elizabeth's father, George VI, her grandfather, George V, their painted eyes fixed, solemn, judging. It was here that the most powerful document in the monarchy's modern history lay sealed. A leather-bound folder, stamped with the royal insignia, its edges worn smooth from careful handling. And it was here that Harry stood, leaning forward, as if he belonged. Let's be blunt, he didn't belong there. Access to that room wasn't handed out like biscuits at tea. It was restricted, locked, reserved for only the most trusted. Lawyers, secretaries of state, family members with specific permission. And Harry? He had long since stepped outside of those inner circles. Yet somehow there he was, pen in hand, head bowed over the document that was never meant to be touched. Now ask yourself, what must that have felt like? The silence of the room pressing in. The air heavy, charged. His pulse racing, maybe his palms damp with sweat. One wrong move and centuries of tradition could unravel. Was he nervous? Or was he convinced he was entitled? That is the contradiction that makes this moment so electric. And then, fate intervened. A sound, the faint creak of a door. Soft footsteps echoing down the corridor. Harry froze. He turned his head just enough to see her, Princess Anne, entering the room with the same quiet authority she had carried all her life. Her eyes scanned quickly, and then stopped. They locked on him, on the pen in his hand, on the folder before him. Time seemed to splinter. In that instant, Anne saw not just her nephew. She saw the act. She saw the betrayal. What do you do in that moment, if you're Anne? Do you shout, summon guards, tear the paper from his hands? Or do you let the silence hang heavy, letting him feel the weight of being caught? Anne chose silence, at first, and that silence was louder than any scream could have been. Her expression hardened, her jaw tight, her eyes unwavering. Harry looked back at her, trapped, exposed. For a man who had spent years outmaneuvering the press, controlling narratives, suddenly there was no spin. Just him, the will, and the watchdog staring him down. Let's pause here for a second. Consider the irony. Harry had come to Britain under the banner of reconciliation, publicly declaring he wanted peace, unity, a mending of ties. Yet here he was, caught in the shadows, undermining the very foundation of trust. Doesn't it feel almost Shakespearean? A prince returning home, not to heal wounds, but to deepen them. And what about the room itself? Every detail seemed to conspire against him. The portraits staring disapprovingly, the silence echoing like judgment. Even the faint tick of a clock in the corner, counting down the seconds of his undoing. And finally spoke, her voice low, firm, and edged with steel. "What are you doing, Harry?" It wasn't a scream. It didn't need to be. The weight of those 5 words crushed the air. Harry stumbled, his hand tightening on the pen, his mouth fumbling for an explanation. But what explanation could possibly work? Curiosity? Nostalgia? A grandson just looking? No excuse could erase the image of him leaning over the Queen's will with pen in hand. Let's turn this question to you. If you were Harry, what would you have said? Would you have confessed, begged, tried to appeal to Anne's sense of family? Or would you have lied, scrambling to cover the unforgivable? Harry chose the latter. Words tumbled out. Excuses about wanting to understand, about wanting to make sure things were fair. But each word only dug the hole deeper. Because for Anne, fairness wasn't the issue. The issue was respect. The issue was loyalty. And Harry, in that moment, had betrayed both. But Anne wasn't finished. She stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them. Her voice sharpened. "Do you think she didn't know what she was doing? Do you think you know better than your grandmother?" That's when the full weight of the crime hit him. Because tampering with a will wasn't just an act of desperation, it was an insult to the Queen herself. To imply that her choices weren't good enough, that her legacy needed rewriting, that Harry, the grandson who had fled, knew better than the woman who had reigned longer than any monarch in history. The tension thickened. Harry's excuses faltered. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a way to salvage himself. But there was none, because in that sacred space, he was exposed. And then, something chilling, and didn't move to stop him. She didn't grab the paper. She didn't call the guards. Instead, she turned and left. Silent, controlled, purposeful. Why? Because Anne wasn't interested in an argument in a darkened room. She was interested in consequences. And she knew that when she revealed what she had seen, the palace itself would erupt. Harry was left standing there, pen in hand, heart pounding, knowing that the silence of the room had become a prison. Every portrait, every ticking second told him the same truth. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But the real question remained. What would Anne do with what she had just witnessed? The answer would unleash chaos that no reconciliation could ever repair. What drives a man to cross the one line no one else dared to cross? That's the question hanging in the air as we step into the moment itself, the act of alteration. Prince Harry wasn't just standing in a forbidden room. He wasn't just leaning over the Queen's sealed will. He was allegedly doing the unthinkable, tampering with it. Let's strip this down. This wasn't a casual glance at family papers. This wasn't curiosity about history or inheritance. This was action. Pen to paper. The choice to leave a mark where no mark was meant to be left. What could he have been altering? Was it a single word? A name? A phrase that could shift millions in inheritance, change the ownership of estates, or tilt the balance of royal favor? Sometimes it doesn't take much, just a stroke of a pen, a line added or removed, and centuries of tradition collapse like a house of cards. Think about it. The Queen's will could have included instructions about Balmoral Castle, Sandringham, or priceless jewelry collections. It might have specified who would inherit personal letters, diaries, or heirlooms meant for future monarchs. And tucked inside those pages might have been one of the most pressing questions. What role, if any, would Harry's children play in the future of the monarchy? Now imagine Harry, carrying years of resentment, believing his children had been denied their rightful place, believing he himself had been treated as disposable. Can't you see him convincing himself he was correcting an injustice? That he wasn't stealing, he was restoring balance? That's the trap of desperation. It dresses itself up as righteousness. But here's the contradiction. If he truly believed in breaking free, in leaving the monarchy behind, why meddle at all? Why return to the very system he claimed to despise? The answer may be as simple as this. The monarchy is both the prison he wanted to escape and the crown jewel he couldn't let go of. Let's pause and ask you directly. If you felt sidelined your entire life, if you felt the world reduced you to despair, would you be tempted to reach for more? Even if it meant betraying the memory of someone you loved? Harry's hand moved, the ink flowing. Maybe it was his children's names he wanted added. Maybe his own position reinforced. Perhaps even a small but symbolic adjustment, something the world would never see, but something that would tilt the Queen's intentions in his favor. But in that very act, he crossed from grievance into betrayal. Because a will isn't just words. It's trust. And trust, once broken, cannot be restored. Anne's gasp had already shattered the silence. Harry knew she'd seen enough. His heart must have been pounding, his mind racing. Should he stop? Pretend? Cover it up? Every second stretched into eternity. Let's not forget the gravity here. Altering a will is not just scandalous, it's illegal. For anyone else, it could mean prosecution, disgrace, ruin. For Harry, it meant something even more dangerous. Permanent exile from the very family he had once called his own. And yet, in that heartbeat between being caught and being condemned, Harry didn't stop. He pressed harder. The scratch of his pen grew bolder, as if in defiance, as if to say, if I go down making my mark. This is where the story becomes almost tragic, because no matter what he added or erased, the damage wasn't in the words, it was in the act. The very image of him, pen in hand, hovering over the Queen's final words, was enough to stain his reputation forever. And, frozen for a moment, had already made her decision. She would not wrestle him in that room. She would not shout. She would not give him the chance to spin it into a misunderstanding. No, she would let the act speak for itself. She would carry what she saw to Charles, to William, and to the monarchy's inner circle. And when she did, the fire would consume everything. Here's the irony that cuts deepest. Harry might have believed he was protecting his family, his wife, his children, his future. But by trying to alter the Queen's will, he risked destroying any chance of belonging to the royal family ever again. Let's take a moment to reflect. The Queen built her life on discipline, control, restraint. Harry, in contrast, built his new identity on freedom, rebellion, exposure. Their paths had diverged long before her death. And yet, in this one act, their legacies collided. One stood for order, the other for chaos. And chaos, in that moment, was winning. The pen left the paper. The deed was done. The silence returned, heavier than before. Harry straightened, his eyes darting toward the door, toward the portraits on the walls that seemed to watch him with eternal disapproval. For a second, it was as if the very weight of history pressed down on him, suffocating. But history was not done with him yet. Because while the ink dried on that page, the consequences were already racing through the palace corridors, carried by Anne's footsteps, carried by her resolve. And the confrontation that followed would make the act itself look small in comparison. Because when Anne and Harry faced each other again, words would finally be spoken, and those words would ignite the chaos that would consume them all. What happens when silence finally breaks? When a stare turns into words, and words turn into a storm. That was the moment Princess and Prince Harry collided, not as aunt and nephew, not as family, but as defender and betrayer. The palace air was already tense, and had seen the act. She had watched Harry's pen move across the Queen's will. She had left him there, standing in his guilt. But silence could only last so long. The confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it was fire against steel. Picture it vividly. A private chamber, heavy curtains drawn, lamps casting shadows across walls lined with portraits of monarchs long gone. Harry paces, restless, rehearsing excuses in his mind. Then, footsteps, measured, deliberate, unmistakable, and enters, her presence like a blade cutting through the air. Her eyes lock on him. No warmth, no hesitation, just resolve. Why? She asks, her voice low, clipped, dangerous. Not a question for clarification, but accusation. Harry stiffens. His face tightens. He tries for calm, but his voice wavers. You don't understand. I had to. It wasn't fair. Fair. That word echoes like a curse in a family where fairness has never truly existed. The monarchy is built on hierarchy, not equality, and knows it better than anyone. She leans forward, her tone sharp. Fair? Do you think the monarchy is fair? Do you think your grandmother spent 70 years holding this family together because it was fair? She did it because it was her duty. And you've just spat on that duty. The words hit Harry like a slap. He glares back, defiant now. Duty? What about loyalty? What about family? She would have wanted us, all of us, treated equally. She loved me. She loved Meghan. She loved our children. And doesn't flinch. Her voice hardens further. She also loved the crown. More than herself. More than any of us. Do you think she didn't make her decisions carefully? Every word in that will was hers, not yours. And you dare to change it. There it is, the heart of the confrontation. For Anne, this isn't about property. It isn't about inheritance. It's about betrayal of the Queen's memory. For Harry, it's about survival, recognition, validation. Both sides fueled by emotion, both convinced they're right. Now ask yourself, who do you side with? The watchdog defending the sanctity of a monarch's will? Or the grandson, desperate to secure his children's future in a family that has consistently pushed him aside? Harry's hands tremble. His voice rises, anger breaking through. I was never enough for this family. Never. Always second. Always ignored. And now my children, her great-grandchildren, were about to be erased. I couldn't let that happen. I won't let history repeat itself. And steps closer, her presence unshakable. And so you would rewrite history with ink? You would dishonor her, dishonor all of us, just to soothe your pride. The tension is unbearable. The silence after her words lingers like smoke. Harry's breathing is ragged. His eyes flash with defiance. But beneath the anger, there's something else, fear. He knows she has the power to expose him. He knows the weight of her word carries more than his excuses ever could. And straightens, her expression unreadable now. Her decision is made. She turns, heading for the door. Harry panics. His voice cracks, desperate now. If you tell them, they'll never forgive me. Please, Anne, don't. She pauses, her hand on the doorframe. Her back still to him, her voice steady, almost cold. You made your choice, Harry, and now you'll face what comes with it. The door closes behind her with a thud that feels final. Harry is left alone, the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor, the ink on the page still fresh, damning him. He knows she's gone to Charles. He knows William will soon hear. And he knows that when they do, the fragile illusion of reconciliation will explode into chaos. Because what began as a secret act in a quiet room is now about to become a royal war. But what Anne didn't expect was Harry's next move. A desperate attempt to salvage what little he could, one that would push the family to its breaking point. What happens when a secret is too heavy to contain? When silence turns into urgency, and urgency becomes alarm. That was the moment, Princess, and carried the truth of what she had witnessed from that dimly lit room into the heart of the palace. She knew what she saw. She knew what it meant. And she knew there was no time to waste. And didn't storm through the corridors shouting. That wasn't her style. She moved quickly, deliberately, her heels striking against polished floors like a drumbeat of inevitability. Guards and staff stepped aside instinctively, sensing the storm in her stride. Her face was set, her jaw tight. The Princess Royal had seen betrayal, and now she was about to light the fuse. Inside his private study, King Charles sat alone. The weight of the crown pressed heavy on his shoulders, not just in ceremony, but in reality. He had spent his whole life preparing for this role, and yet it was lonelier and heavier than he had ever imagined. Papers lay scattered on his desk, briefings from ministers, reports from aides, condolences still pouring in for the loss of his mother. His pen scratched across a document, but his mind drifted until the door opened and entered without ceremony. Charles looked up, startled by the urgency in her eyes. And he asked. But before he could say more, she closed the door behind her. We have a problem, she said. Charles frowned. What now? His voice carried the fatigue of a man who had weathered too many crises already, and stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. It's Harry. The name alone made Charles sigh, rub his temple, lean back in his chair. What has he done this time? Anne's words cut through the air like glass. He tampered with Mother's will. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles froze, his eyes narrowing. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe he misheard. But the look on Anne's face told him she wasn't mistaken. She wasn't exaggerating. She had seen it with her own eyes. He had the will in front of him, and continued, pen in hand, writing. I caught him. He didn't even try to deny it. Charles's breath caught. His chest tightened. The betrayal was almost too much to process. His mother's final words, the sacred document meant to preserve her legacy, violated by his own son. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This cannot be true. It is, and said firmly. And you know what it means. If word gets out, the monarchy will be torn apart. We can't bury this. We can't spin this. He's crossed a line none of us can defend. Charles turned away, pacing the room. His hands shook. Part of him was a father who loved his son despite everything. Another part was a king who could not afford weakness. The two roles collided in his chest like thunder. And then, the door opened again. William entered. His timing could not have been more explosive. He saw Anne's expression, Charles's agitation, and instantly sensed the gravity of the moment. What's happened? William demanded. Charles hesitated, his eyes darting between his sister and his heir. But Anne, unflinching, answered. Your brother was caught altering the Queen's will. William froze. For a second, disbelief flickered across his face. Then anger. His fists clenched, his jaw locked. What? And repeated it, every word deliberate. He was writing on it. I saw him. William's face flushed with fury. He stepped closer, his voice rising. That's not just betrayal. That's treason against her memory, against everything she stood for. Charles raised a hand, trying to steady him. We need to be careful. We need to think. But William cut him off. No, we've thought long enough. We've forgiven him again and again. And this is how he repays us? By defiling our grandmother's last wishes? Enough is enough. The room vibrated with tension and stood firm. William seethed, and Charles wrestled with a storm inside him. His son, his duty, his crown. Meanwhile, whispers began to ripple beyond the study. Staff who had seen Anne's face, who had heard raised voices, who had felt the unusual tension in the air. Rumors spread like wildfire through corridors and kitchens, through guards and aides. Something had happened, something involving Harry, and within hours, the alarm would spread beyond the palace walls. Because secrets in Windsor never stay secret for long. But before the world knew, the royal family itself had to decide. What do you do when your own turns against you? Do you protect him, bury the scandal, shield the monarchy from shame? Or do you expose him, let the truth burn, and cut him loose forever? Charles's voice finally broke the silence, trembling with conflict. We must speak with him. Now. And nodded. William's eyes burned. And somewhere else in the palace, Harry waited, knowing the alarm was already ringing, knowing the reckoning was coming for him. But he had no idea how brutal that reckoning would be. What does a king do when fatherhood collides with the crown? That was the cruel question pressing down on King Charles as the alarm over Harry's actions spread through the palace. A father's heart begged for mercy. A monarch's duty demanded judgment. And caught between those two roles, Charles found himself standing on the edge of an impossible choice. The study was suffocating. Charles paced back and forth, his footsteps echoing off the walls. His face was pale, his hands restless, his mind caught in a storm. And sat rigid in her chair, her arms crossed, her gaze locked on him like a sentinel. William stood by the window, silent but seething, his jaw set, his fists clenched. The air was thick with unspoken words. Charles finally broke the silence. He's my son, and didn't flinch. And she was our mother. He defiled her will. Which matters more now, Charles? Blood, or the crown? The words cut deep. Charles winced, the father in him recoiling at the bluntness, but the king in him recognized the truth. This wasn't about family squabbles. It was about the sanctity of the monarchy. William turned sharply, his voice sharp, filled with rage that had been simmering for years. This isn't the first time, father. He betrayed us with interviews. He humiliated us in his memoir. He dragged mother's name through the mud. He painted us as villains to the world. And now this. Tampering with grandmother's will? It ends here. Charles closed his eyes, the words battering him. He wanted to argue, to defend Harry, to cling to some shred of paternal instinct. But how could he? The evidence was undeniable, and had seen it herself. And Charles knew, and she didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. If she said Harry did it, Harry did it. Still, the father in him tried. He's hurting. He's lost. He believes he was never enough. William snapped. And whose fault is that? He made his choices. He walked away. He turned his back on all of us. And now he wants to rewrite the Queen's legacy for his own gain? This isn't hurt. This is greed. This is betrayal. And spoke next, her voice cold but steady. We cannot allow sentiment to cloud this. If word spreads that the Queen's will was compromised, the public will never forgive us. Trust in the monarchy will shatter. We must act decisively. Charles sank into his chair, his head in his hands. The crown weighed on him like lead. He thought of his mother, the Queen, and how she would have handled this. She had been a fortress, unyielding, pragmatic, never allowing her personal feelings to endanger the crown. Could he do the same? Here's the contradiction that made the moment unbearable. Charles had waited his entire life to be king. And now, in his first true test of leadership, he was forced to choose between his son and his crown, between love and duty, between blood and legacy. Ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you protect your child, even if it meant risking everything your family had built for centuries? Or would you sacrifice him to save the institution that defines your very identity? The silence stretched on. Charles's breathing was heavy. William's anger was boiling over. Anne's resolve was unshakable. Finally, Charles lifted his head. His eyes were tired, but firm. We will confront him, Charles said, his voice low. He deserves to explain himself. But make no mistake, if he cannot account for what he has done, he will face consequences. William nodded sharply. There can be no half measures. Not this time. And gave a curt nod. I'll stand by whatever must be done. But know this, Charles, if you falter, if you let him walk away unpunished, you risk everything. Charles's heart ached. He thought of Harry as a boy, laughing with Diana, chasing William through palace gardens. He thought of the bond that once existed between father and son, now buried beneath years of mistrust. He thought of Meghan, the catalyst of so much division. And he thought of Archie and Lilibet, innocent children caught in a storm they never chose. For a moment, he wondered, was Harry really the villain? Or was he the product of a system that had broken them all? But the thought passed quickly, because in the end, intention mattered little. Action was everything. And Harry's action had crossed a line no king, no father, could ignore. The decision was made. The confrontation would happen. And Charles, torn though he was, would have to stand not as a father, but as a king. But what none of them realized was that this confrontation would not stay private. Because outside those palace walls, whispers were already leaking. Staffers, aides, someone who had overheard too much, the story was spreading. And when the public caught wind of it, the scandal would ignite into a firestorm. For now, though, all eyes turned to the one man who had set it all in motion. Harry, unaware that the king, his brother, and his aunt were coming for him. Unaware that his excuses would not be enough. And unaware that what was about to unfold would not just fracture the family. It would threaten the survival of the monarchy itself. What does rage look like when it's no longer hidden behind polite smiles and staged photographs? When years of resentment boil over into something raw, unfiltered, and unstoppable. That was the storm brewing inside Prince William. For years, he had carried the burden of patience, diplomacy, and restraint. But when he heard the words, Harry tampered with the Queen's will, that patience shattered like glass. William's fury was not sudden. It was layered, built over years of betrayal. This was not just about the will. This was about everything. About Diana. About loyalty. About being forced into the role of protector while his younger brother played the victim. About watching Harry burn bridges that William had spent years trying to hold together. Let's step into that moment. William stood by the window, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. His chest rose and fell in short, sharp breaths. His eyes, normally calm and steady, blazed with a fire that even Charles had rarely seen. And had delivered the accusation, Charles had hesitated, but William had no hesitation at all. Enough, he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. This isn't just a mistake. This isn't some slip of judgment. This is a betrayal so deep it cannot be forgiven. Charles tried to calm him. William. But William spun on his father, his voice rising. No, Don't tell me to calm down. You've been protecting him for years. You let him run wild, say what he wants, do what he wants, and every time, we pay the price. And now? Now he dares to touch her will. His voice cracked, heavy with emotion. Grandmother's will. The word grandmother struck like a hammer. This wasn't just about monarchy. This was about family. About Elizabeth, the woman who had guided them all, who had been their rock through every storm. To William, tampering with her will wasn't just an act against the monarchy. It was spitting on her grave. Let's pause here and ask, have you ever felt the kind of anger that leaves no room for forgiveness? The kind that burns so hot it feels like it will consume you? That's what William carried in that moment. He turned back to the window, his voice low but seething. He betrayed her memory. He betrayed all of us. He betrayed me. Here's the contradiction that makes William's fury so compelling. For years, he had defended Harry, even when it hurt him. He had been the older brother, the protector, the one who absorbed the blows when Harry lashed out. After Diana's death, it was William who kept the family together, who shielded Harry from the worst of the media. He had stood by him through military service, through struggles, through scandal. But now the one person who had shared that childhood trauma with him had turned into the enemy, and watched silently, her face unreadable. She knew William's anger was dangerous, but also necessary. It was the fury of an heir who understood that his brother's actions threatened not just family harmony, but the survival of the very institution he was destined to inherit. Charles, torn as always, tried to speak. William, he is still my son. Your brother. There must be a way. But William cut him off again. No, you're not just his father anymore. You're the king. And if you don't act, I will. Because I will not let him destroy what grandmother built. I will not let him drag this family into the mud again. His words carried a terrifying clarity. William wasn't speaking as a brother. He was speaking as a future king. And in that role, Harry was not family, he was liability. Now let's turn to you. What would you do if your sibling betrayed not just you, but the legacy of the person you loved most? Would you forgive? Or would you cut them off forever? William's decision was made. Forgiveness was no longer on the table. His fury demanded justice. He stepped closer to his father, his voice cold now, stripped of emotion. If you will not punish him, then when it's my turn, I will. He will not stand beside me. He will not be part of my reign. He is finished. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and didn't speak, but the flicker in her eyes said she agreed. Charles looked stricken, torn between the love of a father and the duty of a king. And somewhere else in the palace, Harry sat unaware that his brother's fury had already condemned him. But fury alone wasn't the end of it. Because while William seethed behind palace walls, whispers were leaking outside. And soon, the media would catch wind. And when the press got hold of the story, William's fury would not be confined to the palace. It would explode onto the world stage. What happens when walls themselves seem to listen, when whispers slip through cracks faster than the royal family can contain them? That was the atmosphere in the palace after Anne's revelation. Secrets, in a place like Windsor, never stay secret for long. They seep into hallways, echo in staff corridors, trickle into kitchens, and before anyone realizes it, the whispers have already turned into a storm. The confrontation between Anne, Charles, and William was meant to be private. But the palace is never truly private. Guards outside heard raised voices. Aides noticed the urgency in Anne's footsteps. Courtiers saw William storm from the king's study, his face flushed, his jaw locked tight. Each detail became a piece of a puzzle. And palace staff are masters at putting puzzles together. Something's happened, one whispered to another. It's about Harry, came the reply. Rumors thrive in silence. And the tighter the family tried to hold their secret, the louder the whispers grew. Let's pause here, because this is where irony steps in. The monarchy, for centuries, has survived on control. Control of image. Control of narrative. Control of the gap between private truth and public perception. But the very walls of their palaces, filled with staff and servants, made secrecy impossible. And in this case, the secret was too explosive to contain. Within hours, the whispers carried through corridors, out to drivers, aides, and security. Harry's in trouble, they murmured. Something about the Queen's will. Some dismissed it as gossip. Others leaned in, hungry for more. And then, inevitably, someone spoke to the press. The first hint didn't appear in a front-page headline. It started subtly. A cryptic post on social media. A journalist tweeting, "Unusual tension reported at the palace today. Rumors swirling about family documents." It was vague, but enough to stir curiosity. Inside the palace, the family knew what was happening. The walls were no longer safe. Every word spoken echoed beyond gilded doors. And Harry, the center of it all, felt the walls closing in. Imagine being him in that moment, sitting in his guest quarters, restless, waiting for the inevitable. He had seen Anne's eyes. He knew she wouldn't stay silent. He knew William's fury, Charles's hesitation, and the monarchy's obsession with secrecy. Did he regret what he had done? Or did he still convince himself he was right? This is where contradiction plays its cruel game. Harry had spent years exposing the monarchy, breaking the wall of silence. And yet, in this case, he desperately needed silence. But the palace doesn't keep secrets, not anymore. Not when betrayal tastes this sweet to the press. And knew it. William knew it. Even Charles, hesitant as he was, knew it. The monarchy was about to be hit with another scandal. And this time it wasn't going to come from Netflix deals or memoirs. It was going to come from within their very walls. Let's ask you directly, if you were a royal staffer, would you have kept the secret? Or would the temptation of leaking it to the press, of being the first to break the story, be too strong to resist? Because that's exactly what happened. Someone talked. The whispers became a leak. And the leak became a spark. The palace tried to control it, of course. Statements were drafted. Words like nonsense and misunderstanding were tossed around. But the truth? The truth was uglier than any press release could polish. Harry had been caught, pen in hand, over the Queen's will. And the public was about to find out. Meanwhile, inside the palace, chaos grew. Staff walked on eggshells. Advisors scrambled for strategy. Guards tightened their watch, knowing tempers were running high. And through it all, William's fury and Anne's resolve burned brighter. Charles, though, sat in his study, torn. He wanted to shield the family, shield Harry, shield the monarchy. But how could he shield them from themselves? This is the cruelest irony of all. The Queen had held the monarchy together through wars, divorces, scandals, even Diana's death. But now, only months after her passing, her family was ripping itself apart over the very document meant to preserve her legacy. And the palace walls, once symbols of strength, had betrayed them. Their whispers had carried the truth outside, to a world that would devour it. The headlines were coming. The public reaction was coming. But before the story exploded across newspapers and screens, one more fire ignited inside the palace itself. Because Harry decided he would not wait quietly for judgment. He was going to make his move. And what he chose to do next would push the chaos beyond control.